live. Thank you for coming through.
It's okay.
Like it's quite interesting because I've been watching a lot of the stuff you've been putting on your Instagram, and like a lot of it has resonated with me on the level of the people that I know and the experiences that they've had. And I also found that I'm really horrible at remembering your name, even though I know your name. Like, I know what your name is, but I'm just always like, peace, love, and kicks.
Yeah.
It's just, it's always just like, it's easy to remember
That's what
people's...
Instagram does, right?
Yeah, social media
That's
handles.
my real name. I changed it by default.
Peace, love, and kicks.
Peace, love, and kicks.
Awesome. Well, tell us what you do.
Yeah. So predominantly I'm like a youth worker, a peer support youth worker. I work with young people. At the moment I work with young people, supporting them into education and employment with mild to moderate mental health. And it's a partnership to support young people to get off the benefit, basically. But they recognise that there were a lot of young people that were on the benefit that were being forced into kind of like any job or any course, racking up heaps of student loans, or going and working in trade jobs or factory jobs that were maybe doing more harm than good to them. And then they were ending back up on the benefit like 3 months later. So the ministry decided to make a partnership and bring in Odyssey House and support young people to find sustainable education and employment. Yeah.
Okay. No, it's interesting you say that, because in my mind, every time somebody talks about benefit, right, especially about young people, there's always this whole sentiment like, everyone's just being lazy and they just don't want to work. They need to go to work. But people don't realize like how horrible it is to work in any odd job when they just force you to go somewhere, because that's this whole
whole
benefit
destroying, right?
Yeah, it's like this whole like benefit scheme, like it's what is it, the job seeker or whatever. So it's just like we'll help you with that, go do this shit here, and here's a job for you. It's just like, I feel like if you're in a place, especially as a young person, where you're struggling to find your way in life and you get forced into that, I feel like the effect, the pushback from the person themselves is going to be quite bad.
Yeah, and you have to think about like the environment that we're in as well, like COVID environment, and there are so many young people that I've worked with that have gone and studied like degrees. They've got like formal education and they've been on like a student allowance this time. And then they graduate and boom, COVID hits. And they are educated, but they can't really find a job that they think is like going to honour the work that they've done as well, That is very true. I actually have experience with that myself. It's kind of like, it also makes you question education in general, because there's always this push. It's kind of like, okay, well, you've done your schooling, you're in the real world now, what you going to do? You can go find a job, but if you want to do any kind of, anything kind of meaningful and anything that's even going to give you any chance at success down the line, you need to have a degree of some sort, right? And then, a lot of people eat it up. I mean, myself included when I first started this, but you realize that it's really just a game of bureaucracy. You just need to get that piece of paper. I don't necessarily rate the education itself. Like, I don't feel like I've learned something that was so mind-blowing that I could apply somewhere. But in saying that, once you're done, you end up with the student loan, you just finished, and you're like, okay, I've put in all this work. I struggled through this. And what now? No, it's so confronting, like to have like a fine arts degree and be left in like an environment where that isn't actually going to serve you for anything. Not
to mention the whole entry level thing. It's just like, you look at it, and a person that hasn't got an education versus a person that has, well, they're going to be paid the same. And if anything, if we kind of look at it from a point of view of, say, like a young person especially, I think it really matters to you as a young person too, because I remember it did to me. If you start, say, let's pick 18 as a starting point, and you get a person that gets into a job and say 3 years down the line, they're going to be a lot further ahead than the person that just spent 3 years studying and now has to get a job. And everywhere they go, they say, well, yeah, it's great you got a degree, but you got fuck all experience. So here's, a minimum, essentially a minimum wage, even if it is, some fancy firm, and you have to survive off of that. And that's
and you think
rough.
about like their last semesters, for a lot of them, they were in lockdown, and so those practicums, the placements, the sort of like job experiences that they have towards the end of your degree, those things weren't really happening. So you've got young people that were maybe in formal education, and then they have no real experience. They've been kind of shut in, and that's when other pre-existing stuff comes out, like the anxiety, the alcohol use, the cannabis use, that sort of thing starts to really like pick up, because it's a scary world out there, especially when you come from years of education and then formal education, and then boom, you're free now.
Yeah, go and do
but
something
to
with
what?
it.
Yeah.
No, I know exactly what you mean as well. I actually, especially the first degree that I did, was a bachelor's in international business, and I was actually overseas at the time. It was part of the degree that I could go and essentially swap a semester of study for...
Yeah, it's like a rite of passage, right? You go and do it overseas.
Yeah, for work experience. So they let me sub that in. And when I was finishing, I just remember the amount of stress I was under. I was just like, what the fuck am I going to do after this? Because this is going to end and I'm going to have to go back home. So, back to New Zealand. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. Yeah. So, and when you talk about mental stress, I remember a situation where I would literally, to me, how stressed you gotta be to go to a liquor shop and buy one of those little bottles of shit. those functioning alcoholic packs of shit. That's where I was at. I'm just like, I'm so stressed.
Like something you don't even need a glass for. You just want you're gonna drink it now.
Yeah. Like you're not gonna go to a bar or anything. Like I literally went to the neighborhood I grew up in back in the day. I showed up and I just sat there, which, again, I'm just kind of reflecting on my entire life at that point. And I'm like, I'm drinking that. I'm like, man, this is fucking depressing.
Yeah, and that's without COVID, right?
Yeah. No. So I can only imagine what that's like. Actually, I finished another lot of postgraduate study through the lockdown last year. Again, with that, it's kind of like, well, okay, great. Here you go, guys. You're graduating. You've done all this work. Congratulations. Nobody wants to hear anything about that because all the companies are in a crunch. Everyone's in a lockdown.
Exactly,
hiring freezes.
Yeah. It's a really challenging environment for young people with predisposition to mental health challenges to go into. So when I heard about the project that it was being created, it was the first of its type in Australasia to have people with lived experience like myself, peer support, and a clinician or a counsellor, and then an education and employment specialist as well, do a full wraparound service. It just made heaps of sense to me to be that was something I wanted to be a part of. So I think previous to that, I was doing a lot of work in the city with young people that were experiencing homelessness, high needs young people transitioning out of the care of oranga sambariki, and I knew that I had to go and do a diploma or get some higher education if I was going to be able to get the funding that I needed to run the programs that I wanted to run. And so that's when that opportunity came up for Odyssey, and I'd always kind of wanted to work for them, so I took it.
With youth homelessness, actually, that's also an interesting one. What did you find, how did you find a lot of young people ended up homeless? Because it's not something that you kind of think of specifically. You think, when you think of homelessness, the thing that comes to mind is, somebody kind of was just down in their luck, everything fell apart, you hear of a lot of stories of people that used to have normal lives before they were homeless. They had families, jobs, something happened, everything fell apart, you ended up on the street. but you don't think of youth ending up on the street. How does that happen?
Yeah, there's a really good reason for it as well, and it's because like youth homelessness is hidden homelessness. For a young person to be able to get to a stage where they are living on the streets, there's had to be like a serious breakdown in their living situation. Of course, like maybe, 1 in 10 is a rebellious young person that wants to run away and have a little bit of fun with their friends for 1 or 2 nights, and ends up out partying on K Road and like hanging around with the wrong crowd. But then they go back to the safe, warm environment that they're from. But for the majority of the young people that end up experiencing homelessness, especially in Auckland, a lot of that is like couch surfing and staying with friends in abandoned buildings. It's not necessarily seen, and the reason for that is because if you're under 18 and you're picked up by the police and you have no fixed abode, then they have to detain you because you're a child. They have to take you somewhere, and if you're running away, then like where you've come from probably isn't that great. And so what that means is that our young people hide because they don't want to be picked up. And so if you were to look at youth homelessness with a lens of what it really looks like, then there would be the understanding of like how big the problem actually is. And the other reason is because it's hidden. We don't have the like data or the statistics to reflect the problem, because it's really hard to collate it because they're hiding, because they don't want to go back to where they've come from.
Yeah, well, it's not exactly like they want to kind of register themselves as a homeless youth.
Right.
You kind of want to stay
but if
under the
someone
radar.
from an authority is talking to them, then like it's
I'm not going to exactly trust them.
nah, it's really
just
hard.
Like, you're going to go and snitch on me, and next minute cops are going to show up and take me somewhere, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah, those relationships take real trust, to be able to develop those relationships. But they're also incredibly rewarding when they do come about, when you're able to get into a position. Like when I first went into those sorts of environments, they were like, who is this random white lady? Like, what is she doing here? And I'm like, hey guys, like, how's it going? But by the end of it, it's like you belong to them, And that's the experience, I think, of a lot of the youth workers that work within that environment. That once you become a part of that community, then they really like honor you and respect you in that space.
Oh yeah, because I can imagine that their outlook on the world in general is just like everything is really against you. The whole system's against you. The environment you came from is against you. So to find any kind of ally in this situation would be, it would take a lot of work, but at the same time you feel like that is something very real. Yeah, it's not something that's just in the passing. And
the solutions that we currently have to like combat those situations just aren't realistic. The solution for young people getting picked up in those environments, if they don't have like a care home or a whānau like situation that they want to go to, they're sent to an emergency accommodation motel. And those majority of the motels that are run by MSD, or contracted by MSD in Auckland, are like incredibly scary, dangerous places. Yeah, like really, really scary places for like a 16-year-old girl to be. And what happens is a young person that maybe is having like a slight family breakdown that goes into one of those environments ends up like a chronic drug user or victims of sexual crimes, all those sorts of things. So it's like re-traumatizing the young people.
It really exacerbates the situation, if anything. Yeah,
it's wild that it would even be a solution. We need more youth-focused emergency accommodations for young people in Auckland. Yeah.
When actually, you gave me this age bracket, but in terms of that, so it's just like, because see, to me, I find this whole like line of 18 years old very interesting. I kind of experienced that, through my like later years of high school, where just you really feel that where they're kind of like, okay, yeah,
you're an adult now.
We're still trying to look after you while you're under 18, but it's a very sudden change once you're 18. Like they just drop kick you out on the street and it's like, off you go take care of yourself. And now we're not really gonna do anything for you if you get into trouble. If before that we'd get some youth workers involved or anything like that, once you hit 18, like it's straight to jail with you if you fuck up.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And you would think, I think the thing that I found the most surprising was that you would expect, there's like this expectation, I had this expectation, like I grew up in the system, right? But still I had this expectation that because of the age of these young people, that they would be afforded an extra level of care. But because it's like a hidden problem, it's actually the opposite. And also, I guess a lot of people kind of coin it maybe to young people that are coming out of the care of Oranga Tamariki, right? They think, oh, they've been in care for their whole lives, and then they turn 18, and then they don't have like social workers or carers anymore, and then bye, sort of thing. But actually, the people or the young people that are most vulnerable are the ones that have never had like a notification put on them. So like there's been huge family breakdowns, but actually nobody really gave a shit enough to like call OT. And so they've ended up homeless, but because they were never picked up or put into the system, they don't have the funding to be able to access like youth housing, those sorts of things that young people that were in the care of OT actually do. So
I mean, at that point, you're not someone with a history of kind of adolescent, incidents or issues or whatever. At that point, you're going straight into a adult classification as a troubled person in society. So and you're treated that way. They don't look at you as, somebody who's like, okay, well, there's been issues. We need to be mindful of that in handling this. It's just like, you're 18 years old. You're an adult now. You've done something, off you go.
Yeah, and the fight that has taken place, like exactly what you're talking around as well, like the age bracket stuff. There's like a collective of people called Manaki Rangatahi that work in together, like LifeWise and Mati Huru Trust, and Chloe Swarbrick's a really massive part of that as well. And the work that they've been doing, the majority of the work that they've been doing for a long time, is just to get the government to recognise that the current homelessness action plan that we have doesn't align with young people, and to even get them to name that, to be like, oh, well, actually, maybe you're right. It's not really working for like, maybe the stuff that's working for like 16 to 18 year olds or 16 to 24 year olds, like isn't working for what's working for the adults, So, but there has been like some changing around that recently, and they've got the government to kind of own the fact that needs to be a youth specific homelessness action plan created.
It's interesting too, because, if you look at, I don't know how to classify it, but if you look at someone that's kind of has a lifetime of criminal experience, right? Just like a career criminal, or just, somebody that's always in and out of jail. Like, I know, I actually happen to know...
recidivist offender, right?
Yeah, like I happen to know quite a few people like that, and...
Me too.
And, like it's interesting because you look at them, like I know most of them and they're like as adults, but if you look at them, this is where it all started. That was the pivotal point. And it's easy to say, I was like, well, you're too far gone now, like you've just always been like this, you got this long rap sheet. But at the same time, I was like, well, if somebody paid attention at the right time, maybe we wouldn't be where we were. And this is where I think the system fails young people, because the most reckless shit, the most, the things that get you into the most trouble is done by younger people. We all know this. We've all been young. We've all done something reckless. We were all rebellious, angry teenagers, or just out of teens. We all had those phases in life. But you realize that later down the line, that like imagine that you had to face the consequences of that as a young person. Where would you be now? You know, and it's like you kind of consider yourself lucky on one hand, but on the other hand, you realize just how unlucky these other people are because of the way the system treated them at that time.
Yeah, and the foundation for that is housing. Like, honestly, the foundation for like, you know, like the hierarchy of needs, you know, you like, it's almost impossible for any person to consider the choices that they're making if they're just trying to stay warm as like primal human beings. Like if we have to, if most of our brain capacity is taken out by like staying warm and dry, then there's no way for us to like have any sort of consequential thinking around like our behaviors or like stealing or, you know, violently acting out or any of those kind of like other things. So it's like, it's like that housing is healing. It's like if they've got like a safe place to land, and it's what we've seen all the time when young people would get housed by us. They were in that like fight or flight survival mode, and things were just kind of like up here. And as they got housed, then like the walls started to come down, and they were able to. That's when the trauma comes up, and that's when they're able to start to kind of really delve into those things and work through it. Does it always work? Is it like, oh, you get a house and now your life is like excellent? Of course not, you know, but it's a really good place to start.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of just this, you know, the recklessness versus the stability of a young person, when you think back to it, you know, it's not just the housing as well. Like, I mean, if you're kind of in a situation where you're constantly pushed into doing things you don't want to do to survive, you know, like even if it's just these crappy jobs they keep telling you that you have to do, and you know, and that's what the society expects of you. It's like, oh well, you got to work hard, you got to rise above it. At which point do you say, well, I don't give a shit anymore, I'm just going to do what I got to do, and more like morals don't apply to me at this point anymore. I don't care what some middle-aged lady thinks I should be doing because of my situation. I'm just like, I'm going to choose crime. Try and stop me.
100%. And there's got to be like this authenticity, like there's got to be hope that comes out of these conversations, right? But there's got to be like an authenticity for them to believe that like change is possible. I've sat on the other side of desks from people my whole life that told me that they knew how I felt, or that you know, just get new friends, or like all of these sorts of things, and I would be like, lady, like look at your watch, you've got no idea how I feel or like what I've been through, you know. And so there has to be people like myself with lived experience in that arena with them, where I can kind of like show them that change is possible. Yeah, and that's why the like development of peer support is so important in this field, and having people with lived experience is so important in this field. However, it takes a lot of work to develop a person to the point where they get to like touch on their own personal experience and trauma every day without like destroying themselves. Yeah.
No, definitely, I can imagine that. I mean, it's something you kind of have to go over all the time, and you know,
I have to be constant vigilance, diet, exercise, you know, like meditation, working on myself constantly, looking after myself constantly. Yeah.
So I mean, because you're trying to help someone, but you don't want to do it at your own detriment.
Yeah, totally.
So, I mean, it's not going to be very good if you know, help someone else and end up kind of.
Yeah, and if I'm in like a trauma shitstorm, like I'm so triggered by a situation that I can't see the tree for the woods, then I'm no good to anyone anyway, you know? Like I'm just dealing with my own internal experiences.
You know, it's funny. It's a pretty shit problem to have. Like this whole situation that we talk about right now. But, and you know, we love to have articles about it. We love to write about it and say, well, look, you know, look, think of the children, right? We have a problem. We have a crisis. And then somebody says, oh, well, it's not a crisis. Yeah, you know, like we've seen a lot of that.
Let's
recently.
let's debate
nothing,
that. Yeah,
nothing is a crisis until, you know, it hits you right in the face, and okay, well, we'll do something. We're still not going to call it a crisis.
Yeah.
Like, you know, but like in terms of that, you still look at it and it's just like, well, why do we have this? Why is the system like this? And what will it take to change that? Have you ever thought about that? What is your idea around what would actually change this dynamic on a fundamental level so we don't have that problem anymore?
I think that there's a lot of changes that are happening within the health system at the moment that reflect where we need to go, right? The collaboration of all of the DHBs coming together, and to become one DHB is going to be like really helpful. Also, the acknowledgement that there needs to be like a Te Ao Māori like management, like health management, like organisation within there that really supports for there to be like a Te Ao Māori like worldview within health. So I think there are a lot of things that are happening that are moving in the right direction. And why is that important? Because like 80% of the young people that I was working with in that space were Māori. And so whether we want to debate where that problem comes from and whether you think it was due to colonisation or whether you believe it's personal choices, like the problem's the problem and it's there. And so how do we change it? And then also what's happening is that over time, a lot of the NGOs within this space have been contracted to support these people, and so it's getting taken out of the wider government organisations and put into like NGOs that have a slightly more broader view and are able to deal with it in a slightly more hands-on way than maybe the red tape of the government organisations allows. There are a lot of cool things happening in the youth homelessness space. A lot of there's been like emergency accommodation created in the city and youth-specific things that are happening, but is it enough? No. And how do I know that? Because the referrals in that space are just like heartbreaking. Having to constantly turn away young people that are like, I was talking to my old boss a couple of days ago when I found out that I was coming on the podcast, and I just wanted to talk to him to see if there was anything that that had happened, and he was like, we've got a new building coming up in St. Luke's, but we could fill it 4 times over, so the problem just grows and grows.
Do you think, obviously you mentioned that the roots of the problem aren't, it's not that they're not important, it's just that they're not really going to give us very much at this point.
No.
But do you think that the present dynamic of society, do you think that could change to address that problem? I'm speaking more in terms of to me, whenever I hear about homelessness and even the mental health aspects that can lead to that, I still think economics, because I've obviously I have a background in economics, but right away I'm thinking about the economic disparity and why we have these problems. Because you don't, how many homeless people in general have you come across that come from wealthy households? You can have problems with your mental health and you can kind of, fall out with people, but you still have something to come back to eventually, whereas a lot of the people that ultimately end up on the streets do not. Yeah, so see, in my mind, I think the problem is still at its root a very economic one.
Yeah. And the money that we do have in that space isn't going to the right places. It's just honestly one of the most disheartening things about working in the homelessness space is the amount of money that it costs to house someone in a motel, for a week. It's about $1,000 and can be anywhere up to $1,500 for one person to be housed in a motel for 1 week. And the damage that it does when you get all of those people that are highly traumatized with complex addiction and mental health challenges in the one space, and they're all just traumatizing each other. But and that's the like social aspect of it, right? But the economic aspect of that is just like it makes absolutely no sense to me that the government would just sign that off and be like, yeah, sure, like working income will just give you that money to go into that environment, but yet when we're like, hey, we want to like work towards a solution that's actually going to stop traumatizing the young people in this space, and they're like, oh no thanks, you know, like there's a lot of money that goes into emergency accommodation.
It's crazy when you think about it. I mean, you know, how much does
thousands?
How much does rent cost?
Thousands.
If you're just flatting, right? If you're just kind of paying rent, you know, who pays $1,000 worth of rent every week? What kind of house can you get for $1,000 a week?
And then on the back of that, who's like, I'm trying to be diplomatic, but like, who's really benefiting off that? You know, like who's getting rich off that? You know, where's that money going? And a lot of the time it's not like, they're not like businesses that are like giving back to the community, you know?
Was it like the motels?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like they're making a lot of money out of these situations. Yeah, they also have to deal with a lot of shit. Like it is, I would not wish it on anyone, you know, like it is constant. And I think especially like when we went into lockdown, because we had to have all people experiencing homelessness off the streets, and so they all had to be housed in emergency accommodation whether they wanted to be or not.
Well, but it's lockdown as well.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, a motel isn't exactly a home or whatever, you know, like you're just locked in a room.
I just remember going there one day to check on one of my young people. There'd been like this huge incident, and these gang members had like kicked in this young person's door and like assaulted them, and it was like this huge thing, which is like really regular in that space. And yeah, that should have been the most shocking thing about that day. But honestly, I remember coming across this like older man who had been there, and he came out to me and he wanted to like grab my hands, and he was just absolutely beside himself and just couldn't stop crying because he just wanted to go back to his park. Like he was like, felt claustrophobic by the walls, and didn't like, he hadn't lived in like inside in like 20 years, and he was like, they're forcing me to be here, and he was just so upset. And I was like, holy shit, like he really doesn't, like he doesn't want a house.
No,
he wants to be in his park.
it's to say similar kind of issues. I mean, even with when we had MIQ, right? You know, when people came back from overseas and just had to sit inside a room for 2 weeks, right? And I mean, that's just 2 weeks. In that context, I mean, that's not the longest time you could kind of spend in a room.
There's a whole channel that come out of it, is a freestyle window, right?
Like. Yeah. No, I mean, it's exactly that. But you have to think about how it affects people's mental health. And I always kind of, I don't know why, it always kind of brought back this whole concept of solitary confinement in prisons, and how it's used as a form of punishment, and how it just always struck me as counterintuitive, because nothing good is going to come of that. You're not rehabilitating anybody. You're actually exacerbating a problem. You're isolating a person, and all they're left with is themselves and whatever problems that they have. Yeah, so, you know, like, I mean,
nothing
it's bad
good
enough.
Comes out of going into the ivory castle alone, right?
I
You
mean,
don't go in there alone.
Idle hands are a devil's playground. So, you know, like, it's bad enough in prison, but now you're not talking about, you know, hardened criminals and that kind of environment, but you expect people to just kind of be okay with it, and especially, you know, young people that are having problems. They didn't do anything. They're not criminals, right? Like they need to be housed.
Their parents sometimes are, you know. They usually run away from a really dangerous situation. What was really interesting about that time as well was how the drug and alcohol use evolved during that time, and obviously there were a lot of chemicals and substances that were normally readily available, cannabis being one of them, that were normally readily available through that time that young people were using to like deal with their trauma, were like daily users of cannabis. And that's when, but then also a lot of them were using like synthetic cannabis as well. And because they didn't have like access to that anymore, then we seen spikes of use things like glue and solvents because they were easily accessible, but also has like the same desired effect. And so it was alcohol,
Well, basically anything you can get your hands on whenever, because I mean, lockdown affected the drug market too.
Yeah, massively, right?
Yeah.
Like hugely. Yeah. And so there were like cannabis was also almost like non-existent in the inner city space. We seen synthetics like change and then like morph into like more dangerous because they were just using whatever they could to kind of like produce it. But then and then alcohol picked up massively as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like these lockdowns have a lot to answer for in general, with people kind of having to deal with this isolation, this constant stress and uncertainty of what's to come. But it's when we're talking about homelessness and especially youth homelessness, it always reminds me of a couple of experiences I've had with people that try to work in that space from very wealthy backgrounds. And I realized just how out of touch certain kind of demographics of our society are with this. They treat this as something that's not necessarily real. It's kind of like reading a book. Like even if it's a true story, it's kind of like when you read a book, to you it's like a movie in your head. You don't actually see, you don't know that it's happening. You can't imagine you or anybody close to you being in that situation. And I think that because of this kind of social layering that we have, that you have these neighborhoods where people just don't know what's going on in the rest of the world because this is their world. Because of that, we aren't seeing a whole lot of change. We aren't seeing a whole lot of kind of empathy for what's going on. And obviously there will be greedy people out there. There'll be people that, and like we encourage this kind of stuff. If anything, in a capitalist world, we encourage this whole dog eat dog kind of I'm the shark of the business world type shit. I get mine. I don't care what happens to everybody else. Like it's all about looking out for number one. But in saying that, this kind of social layering removes any possibility of someone that is a bit more empathetic to actually pay attention to that and say, hey, you know what, maybe I should be a bit more conscious of my environment. Because I feel like throughout COVID and lockdowns, we've seen a little bit of a wealth gap widening, right? We've heard a lot of stories about the rich getting richer and everybody else is just kind of having to deal with the increased costs and just about everything at this point. So I feel because of this wealth gap, I think that is a big cause of the problem as well. People simply don't give a shit. It's a nice thing for them to kind of say, we're all in this together and I'd like to help and do a odd thing here and there, but people get a lot less generous as their like bank balance gets lower, like they're a lot less likely to consider those sorts of like causes or like challenges, right? Yeah, and at the same time, again, because we romanticize this kind of, grind and earn, and this is all about me. I've earned mine, and if you didn't, then you're probably not working hard enough, type thing. I think because of that as well, people just don't look at these things as something that they should be helping. In their mind, it's like, well, look at me. Why aren't you like this? It's the same old Kim Kardashian bullshit. Like, people are just not working hard enough. They just need to get off their ass.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's like
what a video.
It's an extreme example, but I think it's actually a very perfect example of that,
right?
Because all these people with all this money think that, they earn it, that they really deserve it, that they're entitled to it. And at the same time, anybody who doesn't have that, they're responsible for it. The whole poverty mindset as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and even in my own personal journey, I think I often reflect on how much easier things are for me the more money that I've been able to make in my life, and the further away I get from the bottom line of minimum wage, the more that is afforded to me and the easier my life gets, not just because I have the money to be able to afford things, but because I'm taken seriously more financially, and things like phone bills and being able to access certain services, because you have a little bit more money, it's that's that poverty line that they're talking about, It's once you kind of get above that a little bit, then you're able to see, oh shit, that's a thing, yeah.
Yeah, you're afforded a lot of leeway on things as well. It's just even things as simple as being in debt for something, or being late with your payment for something. It's just it's all good. Well, you know what, we'll give you an extra couple of days, do what you got to do. Where there is somebody that doesn't, when you're down bad, it's kind of like, oh, well, you're shit with your money, so you're probably going to be shit with us. And you know what? We're not going to give you anything. Here's a late fee for that.
Yeah.
So, and we're going to make a bad situation even worse for you right now.
We're just going to keep you in the hole forever.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very slippery slope when you're down bad already. It's something that, I remember experiencing in my younger years myself. When you really kind of not earning very much, and you just kind of really scraping together a living, you come across a lot of situations where you start to consider options that you almost already know they're bad. You know that you probably shouldn't take up any kind of any debt. I've seen a lot of that happen in my younger years. People just racking up debt from unsafe sources. And again, crime becomes an option. Crime is always an option. It's one of those things people expect you to have this, moral compass that they have because they live comfortably. But when you're down there...
And you know what? I see it in my personal life, but I see it with young people as well. Definitely where there's a real motivation for change, and then they make the change, and it's that whole thing about they're sitting in some room somewhere using, and they just wish they could get clean and get a job and then get a normal life, and then they with support they do that. They get clean and they get a job and they get a normal life, and they're like, this sucks, and that glamour and glow of an expectation of the fact that by doing the right thing that they'll be provided for is it's not necessarily a thing. And then that's when starting those thoughts around financial crime, really starts to creep back in, and it will take them back out again. Yeah,
I mean, essentially end up relapsing.
Yeah.
In that, in that aspect, because you worked hard to get out of it because you hated it. You didn't nobody enjoys being in that situation where where you're experiencing homelessness, addiction, whatever it is, and you're just well, I just want to get clean. I just want to move on, and you do that, and then you realize that the real world at that level isn't that much fun. So where do you go from here? Are you gonna continue pushing past that kind of ceiling that's put up above you, or are you just gonna kind of say, you know what, I'm tired?
And there's this real like gap in time that happens where where people get clean and then they start, all of the physical kind of symptoms start to go away, and then they start to kind of like to get their relationships with their family back and all of those sorts of things. But there's this real grind of about a year where you've just got to like put your head down and your ass up, because ultimately the thing that will keep you there is developing a life worth living. Like it's about when you're having a bad day and your girlfriend's being annoying and all of those things, and just those things like stacking up and using looks like a really good idea. There has to be enough of a life worth living for you not to want to throw that away. But it's the getting to that point, like getting to the point where it's like, oh, well, I don't want to lose any of that stuff. But how do you build, how do you give someone that stuff?
Yeah.
But it's also really important to earn all that shit on your own, like for them to get to a point where they've done all those things by themselves. And I know, like for me as a young person or as an adult who was like, involved in that kind of lifestyle, was like easy come, easy go. I didn't really care. It's like, this come easy, see you later, so I didn't really respect any of it.
Yeah, you don't value it as much.
I don't value it at all, right?
Yeah.
But now everything that I have, I've worked my fucking ass off for, and so it's like, I don't want to lose any of that. But it can be really hard. It's really hard to convince like an 18-year-old black boy who's been making like $200K a week that like, going and working like at a mechanics is like a really good idea. They come into that lifestyle and they've been able to like make some serious money and have the things that come with that money, despite the other consequences. It can be really hard to convince them like it's a good idea.
Well, that's true. And I mean, like at that point, you don't think about longevity. You think about like, I mean, this is all I got right now. I might as well just kind of make a run for it while I can. Whatever happens later happens later.
Live fast, die young, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, it's those who do live to survive that kind of lifestyle, they really regret it down the line, because that's the thing, is like, it's all good when you're young and reckless and you got the energy to deal with all this shit, but then you do get old. Every hard man that I've known, eventually you lose that energy. Like you're about it if you need to be. You've got the capacity to do it, but you don't want to do this no more. You just want to chill. You just want a bit of stability. Like it doesn't matter whether you kind of want to settle down into some like white picket fence lifestyle, but you just don't want to have to deal with this shit on a daily basis anymore because you're just tired.
Yeah. And ultimately, like that's when people who aren't involved in that lifestyle rest on the relationships that they have in their life, where they can like lean back in. And I'm not saying that everybody that is involved in that lifestyle has a lack of quality, authentic relationships, but a lot of times it's really hard to find people that are like loyal and trustworthy in that scene, And so if you can't like rest into those relationships, then like what is it all kind of for anyway,
No, for sure. Yeah, you really start questioning why try? Why should I make an effort to kind of work towards something, to try to fit into society and everything that everybody always talks to me about how I should be this and that because it's the right thing to do. At which point do you say, I don't give a shit what the right thing to do is? Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to have, like men speaking to other young men about this, right? And not like men that have like studied that in books, men that have like lived that and walked that, women that have lived that and walked that, and yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's the real difference. I think like the people that learn these things from books, there is still use for them.
100%.
You kind of have to synergize them with that experience. It's kind of like I've got the theory, you've got the practice.
It's why it's so important, and it was one of the most sort of surprising things about my role is I thought, because I was a young person who was in like institutions and I, you know, I like, oh, these kids are gonna, you know, think I'm so cool because I was just like them. But actually it was like a 50-50 split. It was like half of them were like, oh wow, she like gets it, and then the other half were like, bro, this one's broken. Like, can you find me one that's like not messed up, please? Like, you know, like there was the young people that really connected with it, and then there's the young people that need the stability and connection of a youth worker who doesn't have that experience, who they know they feel safe with someone who is like had a normal stable life and has learned it from a book.
Yeah, and I mean it's different personalities, right? You know, you have some people need someone to relate to, others need someone to guide them. In that sense, it's slightly different. You know, one just needs to be kind of to feel like they belong. The other one needs to be like, okay, I don't know what the fuck's going on. I need some direction, and unless you're gonna give me that, don't talk to me.
Yeah.
In terms of addiction, I think it's a very misunderstood concept, and I think at this point in our society, we're only just starting to kind of realize that addiction isn't necessarily always a choice, and it's not a crime, you know, because I mean, for the longest of time, you know, drug addicts were almost looked at as drug dealers. You know, it's the same thing. Drugs is drugs. It's all crime. Everything's illegal. Everyone gets locked up. The problem gets worse. In terms of the progress made around that, have you seen much progress from where you're at?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think there's a real move in the sector. There has been over the time that I've been working in it, and particularly around, you know, understanding that addiction is a disease, and it just like any disease, it needs to be treated as a disease, you know, like it needs to be treated from a medical standpoint. And so I think, previously we had just had this like understanding that it was a choice.
Well, expanding on that, right? So when you say it's a disease, a lot of people don't actually understand what that means. When you say it's a disease, to them it's like, well, okay, it's a condition. We need to, you know, it's like, for example, we treat it in a similar way we treat a disease. For example, if you have cancer, we're going to do chemotherapy to try to get rid of the cancer. If you're addicted to drugs, we need to wean you off the drugs. We need to get rid of the chemical dependency, right? But I think what's overlooked is what's beneath that. It's just like chemicals are chemicals, but why did the person take drugs in the first place? Yeah.
It's the recognition that the disease was there before the drugs were there, before the drugs were anywhere near. And I mean, it's a concept. It's not a proven thing. It's like a psychological like theory, right? So it's never gonna be something that is like black and white. But for me, I know that I always felt like there was something missing, and when I found that relationship with drugs, then I felt like I'd found my solution, you know. And so treating it as a disease really allows us to do that. And there's been, I guess, Johan Hari does lots of like really amazing talks around addiction as a disease, and he has like this. That they do an experiment on rats where they put the rats into a cage, and the rats have got like a water, and it's just like them in the cage with nothing else except like a drink bottle full of Coke and then a normal drink bottle like cocaine, and the rats are like, yeah, the cocaine, right? So they're like on the cocaine, and they drink out of the cocaine drink bottle until like they die, because they're just like more, we want that. And then they put the rats into like a rat heaven cage with like swings and roundabouts and like, you know, being in other, and like girl rats and boy rats where they can like hang out and like have fun together and do all of those sorts of things. And what they found is that slowly the rat would shy away from the Coke drink bottle and just have the water. And so it's like, that shows you that it's an environmental thing as well. It's like something that if there is a predisposition, regardless if there's a predisposition, if they have a choice, then they're going to make the right choice if there's like environmental factors to support that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's actually a really good example. I've heard of that study as well. It essentially explains it as like, look, if you're like majority of addiction, we're not talking about just general drug use. We're talking about like the addiction level drug use comes from, your environment. Quite often it's going to be your environment. I mean, it kind of translates into your kind of mental mind state and what it is that you're kind of trying to compensate for with drug use. And somehow we still haven't quite figured out how to address that on a proactive rather than the reactive level. We love to talk about like, drug bust this, somebody's rehabilitated that, but why are people taking drugs in the first place? Why are we not addressing that? Where there's no demand, there is no supply.
Yeah.
If you think that we have a drug problem, it's not because we have a lot of drug dealers, it's because we have a lot of people that will buy them.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a recognition as well that there are a lot of young people as well that are diagnosed with certain personality and psychological disorders that are treated with medication that predisposes them to using other drugs in the future as well, right? And how does our education system set them up to feel inferior in those sorts of environments and set them up where, you need to sit still for 8 hours a day, but you have like attention deficit disorder, and so we're going to give you this like medication. And there's like huge studies around like what that does to it works for a lot of young people, don't get me wrong, but what it does to young people to learn at a really young age that they need something to change the way, not change what they're doing, but who they are. Yeah,
it's kind of trying to change a behavior using substance. You don't give somebody the tools to address certain behaviors and say, okay, cool, this is how I feel right now. I don't like it, but what do you do?
Yeah,
I can do something about it, or I can go and take something for it.
Yeah.
What's easier? What do I know?
Yeah.
What's more accessible to me?
Yeah. And what's more accessible, and then there's the economics around it, right? If there's poverty, there's the stress that comes with like day-to-day living, there's violence, there's trauma, there's the things that are predispose a young person to wanting to pick up when they get to an age where they're old enough to access it. And also usually they're being provided a solution role-modeled a solution by the people that are in their home, because they were role-modeled that solution, and they were role-modeled that solution, that generational trauma that happens. Yeah,
I mean, it's a means of an escape for someone. So, when you think about it, it's very interesting, the narrative that we have around drugs in general in our society, where it's always nice to blame the criminal element. Oh, well, we've done this big drug bust. Drugs are off our street. Look at these guys. They're making so much money out of it. They're bad people. Drugs are here because of them. Like addiction is here because of them. But it's like, well, I don't want to say that no one is, responsible for that. Like, I don't want to downplay that. But on the other hand, like I said, where there is no demand, there is no supply. Drug dealers will go out of business if a person just doesn't need them.
The purchasing of drugs isn't where addiction starts, right?
Yeah.
Addiction starts a long time before they ever pick up a substance. It starts generally at a really young age. There is and that's the majority of the statistics. Obviously, there is like a lot of people that get to like 35
and then have a divorce, and then like start going out and partying, and then develop like a coke habit, or like start smoking pee, you know, like those sorts of things. They happen. People can live relatively normal lives, and then something happens, and then they choose to use drugs to get through it. But the majority of the people that I work with identify that they've always felt like they had that drug-shaped hole inside of them, and that when they used for the first time, they identified that this was going to be the solution to the way that they were feeling. Yeah.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the whole concept of addiction, like you said, it starts long before drug use. You become addicted to escaping certain things in your life. And, you know, in terms of that, it kind of explains the escalation process of an addiction. Because addiction, you know, you don't just go straight for the deep end. Most people start off with something. It'll be the little things just a couple of times, and then things start kicking off.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. It's drugs are never the problem. And drugs were like the solution to the problem. You know, it was what provided them with the space that they needed. It's not a, you know, they don't generally kind of want to be drug addicts.
But yeah, I mean, just to drive this point home, I think for people to understand what we're talking about, I think it's important to understand that it's the social conditions, it's the environment that people are in that triggers certain mental health aspects that then draw you into using substances, and then they kind of snowball into a full-blown addiction as we know it. Because I think this is the thing, is we see that point, but we don't see everything that led up to it and why it's to be considered a disease, because we only look at the person at that point and say, well, what kind of disease is it? Like,
yeah. No, and that's it. The trauma. The trauma is the disease, and the things that are happening in those low socioeconomic areas, those are the disease. But then also there's so many more aspects around, I mean, if you look at advertising around alcohol, and, you know, how many liquor stores there are in South Auckland compared to like the North Shore, which is like 5 times as many, and the real like responsibility that the government has to be able to protect our most vulnerable, that are living at a poverty line, that are stressed out working shit jobs, that are most likely to pick up a substance to be able to use them, and then for them to kind of like wash their hands of like any regulations around alcohol advertising in those economic areas is like ridiculous. It's like the amount of money, damage, domestic violence that happens like out in South Auckland every day because of alcohol is like so huge, and yet if they would, you know, the lawyers from big alcohol sit with sit in our chambers of commerce and talk about all the good shit they're doing with the money that they're putting back into our community. And, you know, our kids can't even go to a bloody rugby game without having like a beer advertisement shoved down their throat. And it's like this culture that we have around like alcohol and fun, especially in the supporting community. And so at what point do our government have the responsibility to change the rules around advertising in those spaces and the damage that it has?
And yeah, really simplifying it to a cause and effect. No, it's kind of like, well, we're trying to do this around smoking, right? We're like, okay, people are getting cancer. This starts from a history of smoking. Therefore, what should we do? We should try and stop people from smoking. We can't, like, we haven't made it illegal because, I mean, I think prohibition was a good example of why it doesn't work. You know, like I'm talking about liquor prohibition back, you know, in the States, whenever that was. People are still going to use what they use. I mean, it's like, you know, it's like drugs. Drugs aren't legal. People still use them. People will still find them. Why is this happening? So it's kind of having to work our way back and figuring out what we can do to actually stop the disease from developing in the first place. Because, like if we have a lot of cases of lung cancer, we're like, okay, this is a problem. What are we going to do about this? We need to nip this in the bud. We need to stop people from smoking in the first place so we don't have this epidemic of lung cancer. The same goes with drug addiction. If we have, higher rates of addiction, well, what are we going to do? Because you can obviously see that making drugs illegal doesn't work.
No.
They'll still find them. It's kind of walking it back to before it starts and finding out the root cause of the problem. But I think this is where nobody can be bothered.
Yeah. It just adds insult to injury that there are, that there are people that make real money out of this, like it adds insult to injury that there are like corporations. Like it's almost more insulting that there's like corporations that are making money out of like advertising and targeting like alcohol to young people than it is that there's like a 35-year-old dude in West Auckland selling tinnies out of his house, like when you compare the amount of like push that those two like people have but the protection that they're afforded as well. Chloe Swarbrick's doing some like amazing work on that at the moment as well. Like she's creating a bill to be able to try and change the amount of like advertising that is allowed for alcohol, and I think making moves towards like limiting the amount of alcohol stores. Like I don't know if you've seen it, but it's like wild. It's like every single corner in South Auckland has like a dairy and a liquor store.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like you think of, for example, the lockdown. I mean, aside obviously from, your toilet paper and everything, what's one other thing that, everybody was after?
Crazy.
Everybody was complaining about, like, well, I need my alcohol.
I know.
So who's doing deliveries?
I know.
need to order some. I need, I'm going to be stuck in this house.
I know, Uber, and then Uber pops up with, alcohol delivery, like free alcohol deliveries. I'm like, oh my gosh, like... I remember the first lockdown, like driving through New Lynn and going past like one of the liquor stores in New Lynn, and there's like a line like all the way out the door. I remember when, because originally it was just like beer and wine that was allowed from the supermarket, and then they opened the liquor stores and people were allowed to buy spirits, and it was like Christmas time, like people lining up around the block to purchase it. But.
Yeah, well, I live out on the west side, so supermarkets aren't allowed to sell beer and alcohol there because of the whole trust has the monopoly on that. And you could really see just how many people were lining up at the liquor shop, because you don't get to kind of dilute them into the supermarket flow. These are the guys that are actually there for that reason, and you see just how how many people there were during lockdown.
Yeah. And look, it's lockdown, and there's a lot of people who are and I'm friends with a lot of them. There's a lot of people that I know, especially in the health and fitness community, right, that use alcohol responsibly and are able to have one or two or go out with their friends or do those sorts of things. And I'm not saying that alcohol is always harmful, just like cannabis is not always harmful. But trying to limit the ability for a 16-year-old to like they're not just going out to party, they're like partying until they're homeless, right? And so it's like limiting that. How can we protect them the best that we can?
Yeah, and I mean, it's also that fine line. Like even myself as an adult, like I'm not against alcohol. I like a good quality drink every now and again. I like to have a good old fashioned or something like that. But you also know when you want to drink because you're stressed. You're not even concerned about what you're going to drink all that much. You're just like, I just need something.
You were talking about with the little baby bottle, right?
Yeah, well, that's exactly that. I wasn't too concerned about what they had. I just knew I was going to get something. It's not like I would show up and be like, oh, you don't have my preferred sort of drink. I'm just like, fuck it, I'm just going to get what you have. And yeah, but it's the tools to deal with such situations that make all the difference.
And the recognition that in those environments and in that demographic area, that the financial stress that we have because of the poverty line is much higher. And so the likelihood that they're going to reach for something that is harmful, and then the effects that that is going to have aren't going to be happy ones, is just so much greater. And what it's happening, like, and what the effect it's having on, in turn, the effect that it's having on us economically, the damage that's being done.
What do you think about like the whole poverty line thing? Like I understand that your line of work is, is a little bit kind of, it's a couple steps like up from the actual, like the big picture, so to speak, the economic big picture, the different classes and demographics of people. What do you think about that? Like what in your mind would be a good, like a full-on solution is going to be very hard, but what steps would you like to see taken to address that?
Yeah, it's really hard. It's just, bring it back to the like Kim Kardashian video where she's like, you've just got to work, all that sort of stuff. And I think about the families that I've met in those environments that work their asses off, like both parents, there's like 3 kids in the house or, more, and both parents work 2 jobs, and they've got like payday loans and financed up to their frickin' eyeballs and like all of those things, but it's not for lack of working.
No, it's not.
It's not for lack of working. They probably work like harder than a lot of people that earn a lot more money than they do. Yeah. And so it's really hard to hear that maybe that there's no way out for them.
Yeah.
There's no way there. It's like they can't just work harder.
No, you can't. You have your limits before you kind of break. I think the misconception is that people think that we live in some sort of meritocracy where, hard work equals pay. Yeah, because it's always nice to kind of bring in all these examples of like, Elon Musk or Bill Gates or whoever, like I work 24/7, I just never stop. I'm like, that's cool, but you get, and you get paid for that kind of effort. Like, I'm glad that you do. But when you look at everything between that very top level and the very bottom, everything in between is just not the same, because a person that earns $100,000 for their salary is not working anywhere near as hard as the person that's making minimum
45,
wage, working a hard job. These jobs are hard because it's easy to say, he probably deserves it, he probably puts in a lot of work.
Yeah.
Do they? How much stress?
I know, and there's like this image, I don't know if you've ever seen it before, but it's like there's a fence, and there's a fence, and the fence is like the poverty line, and there's people standing on boxes, right? And it's like there's like the Elon Musks and the Bill Gates of our world, their boxes like that they were standing on before they started were like, they were much higher because of who they are and the country they were born in, and they're males, they're white,
I think it's also important to kind of not normalize anomalies.
Oh.
Because we don't have heaps of Elon Musk. We don't have heaps of Bill Gates. These are unique ideas, these are unique events in our histories that put them there.
Yeah.
The perfect, the perfect storm, so to speak. I've been reading this book called Outliers, which kind of talks about why is it like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and all these guys are born almost at the same time, because it was the perfect conditions for that to happen.
It's got nothing to do with them. It's the technology itself, right?
Yeah. And the time that they were at,
Yeah.
because they were teenagers when computers were still
it's not
first
you,
starting.
it's science. Yeah.
They got a chance to kind of use these computers at a time when it was very expensive for everyone. They kind of had some sort of special access to that by circumstance. circumstance. It wasn't necessarily because of their financial standing, but just because of that perfect storm of events. And then they blew up. But now we look at them as these ideals of what people should be doing. And like, see, look at them. They work hard. This is how it works. It's like, no, this is not because they work hard. It's because they were there for, you know, with these right conditions. Not to take anything away from that.
Totally.
But to give something to the people that you assume aren't working hard enough. Because these people work just as hard, but the conditions are not the same. They don't have that perfect storm. They have to swim against the flow.
And just how hard it is to watch like someone who is at their full capacity working as hard as they possibly can in an environment that is like soul destroying, but working as hard as they possibly can and just not being able to kind of like make ends meet or get ahead, you know?
And this is when personalities really start to matter as well, because I know people that can work 3 jobs and then just kind of grind through it, but they don't seem to pay as much attention to it. They don't get as stressed by it. They're just kind of like, I mean, like, for lack of a better word, they're almost robotic through it. They just go through it, they do what they got to do, nothing else matters. But then if you're a person that kind of pays a bit more attention to, you know, to your environment, to what you do every day, and at a certain point you just stop in the middle of your day and you think, man, this really fucking sucks. You know, like you're like, at that point you're going to start contemplating like whether it's worth it, whether I need to escape from that. And you know, like, this is where a lot of these issues start.
That's where the escapism of alcohol, drugs, social media, all of those things that like are taking us outside of ourselves, that's where those things are coming from.
So I mean, as quite often the root of the problem is economic.
Yes.
and it's like, it's hard to address without suggesting something very radical, like a full-on revolution. But even if you have a revolution, you still got to know what you're doing, because, you know, I'm being Russian. We've done this 100 years ago. That didn't work out. You know, we thought, let's just, you know, let's have a revolution, take everything and give everyone equal. Didn't work out. This whole communist experiment, you know, went tits up very quickly because it didn't account for, you know, different personalities, for the fact that 2 different people are going to have different drives towards working, but yet you're paying them the same, you know, so this incentive gets taken away. So in that sense, it's an interesting question as to what kind of measures we can take to kind of create this sort of meritocracy where you can kind of, where hard work does equal that reward, that proportionate reward, and we have equality around that.
And when you're working with people in that environment and supporting them to make changes in their lives, so often, you know, we want to be at the top of the mountain catching them before they roll down. But I think the longer I worked in the sector, the more I just had to gain a surrender and an acceptance to the fact that I was at the bottom of the mountain catching people when they got to the bottom of the mountain. Sometimes, like once in a blue moon, I was going to be able to be up there and stop them. But like, the sooner that we can just accept that it is what it is, surrender to that, and then try to be a part of the solution is easier. But if I spend all of my time and energy like up the top of the mountain, like pointing my finger and blaming everyone else around me, then I'm not at the bottom catching anyway, you know?
Well, in terms of where you are at the moment, what's one thing that really sticks out to you that you would like to kind of put out into the world and you would like to see?
There's just so many. I guess.
That's a hard
well,
one.
I mean, what I'm doing at the moment is studying a diploma in like drug and alcohol counselling, right? So I'm like, I recognised in my work in the city that I needed to go away to get completely as qualified as I possibly could, because to be able to create the programs that you want to create and do the things you want to do, you need like those qualifications to get the funding that you need to be able to run those programs, right? So I'm doing that at the moment, but I'm really passionate about is treating synthetic cannabis and developing programs to
research it, find out what it is, like we know what it is obviously, but research it, really find out the effects that it's having on the body, and then treat it in the way that it deserves to be treated, because the way that I've seen it, the effects that it's having on our young people, one, it's killing them, like they're just stopping breathing, but two, it's serving a need more similar to something like heroin or morphine, because it's completely knocking them out, right? So they're going like on the nod, like you would if you were like a heroin user. And so, but it's so cheap. And so yeah, that's what I'm really passionate about. That's where I'm going. I want to be able to create a program to be able to research that, and then treat it the way that it needs to be treated, because there's nothing specific to it at the moment. It's just kind of, we're finding that the treatments used for other drugs like methamphetamine and alcohol, cannabis, those sorts of things, they're just not working for our young people who are addicted to using synthetics. Yeah.
Do you think legalizing cannabis would have any impact on any of this?
It's a really hard one. Like, I change my mind on it all the time. I voted yes. I voted yes for legalization. I think I voted yes because like I've seen the effects that criminalization has on, you know, like I was in jail with like some ladies that were in there for growing cannabis, and it like tore their whole family apart, you know, and they were like the people that we're talking about, the people that are below the poverty line, that work really hard, that are just trying to make a little bit of extra money for their family. And, you know, I don't know if like a 65-year-old woman who's got no previous criminal history really deserves to be, you know, locked up and have her grandchildren and her, you know, be the matriarch of her family. She's raising all these grandchildren because other drugs have impacted that family, and does she deserve to be in prison? I don't know, and I've seen that face to face in my own experience, right? But then also, I would like to see the purchase of cannabis being taken out of the hands of people that also sell other drugs. So I think about young people that I support, 14, 15-year-olds that were having to go to like tinny houses to purchase their cannabis to be able to treat the trauma that they were dealing with, that they weren't ready to deal with through counselling or anything like that yet. And then they were also being exposed to drugs like methamphetamine and MDMA and drugs that ended up, you know, really taking over for them. So I would, even though they're under 18, they shouldn't be purchasing it from a store anyway. I would have liked to be able to see people to be able to purchase it safely. Yeah. But then also, I've had young people in my care that have had their whole lives completely ruined by cannabis, and schizophrenia and psychosis and really severe mental health problems because of daily use of cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like legalization does open a door for at least some sort of regulation. You're not going to solve all the problems. You're not going to stop the people that shouldn't be using it from using it, but it will make it a bit easier because, you know, black market kind of, it doesn't discriminate. You know, you come with your money, you get what you need, which is why, well, you know, like you don't buy alcohol from the black market, really, do you? Yeah. So, I mean, it's a similar thing. It's not going to fully shut the door on a problem, but it'll allow a little bit of control around it. But in saying that, yeah, no, we've actually talked about this on the very first episode about, you know, the impact that cannabis can have on people who are predisposed to having these problems. So, but again, if it's not something that's just this taboo black market thing, even that is a lot easier to address, because I mean, when we talk about, you know, dealing with, you know, alcohol problems, we're a lot more open about it. You know, we can advertise like, hey, let's address this. You know, it's a real thing. You can have free access to it. So therefore, we are kind of, you know, we're a lot less weird about addressing, you know, the problem that it can create, whether it's, you know, with something that's illegal, it's kind of like, well, how do we ask people to come forward with, you know, problems with using something that they technically shouldn't be?
Yeah. And yes, it's another thing, right? Like parents, mums, dads that maybe want to get support around their use of cannabis, but are afraid to contact services and ask for support because of the like legal repercussions that it has. So yeah, obviously they hide it. They'd rather hide it. I was really surprised. I didn't get passed. I really was.
No, I definitely was. I'm like, we passed euthanasia, but we didn't pass that. Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, like we've already talked about how that was, you know, quite a misinformed little referendum where a lot of people just kind of started learning shit after they voted. So I feel like I was a bit disappointed when they said that they wouldn't revisit the issue. I feel like at that point everyone's like, oh, well, can we run this back? You know,
Yeah.
Maybe my opinion might have changed because I've actually found something out about it now that people are talking about it. But because they kind of closed the door on that, I don't know when.
Yeah, what was
We'll
really
do that
disappointing
next.
as well is there was a lot of NGOs and organisations that support people with cannabis, that use cannabis. I'm not like name any names, but there was a lot that were like, oh, we don't really have an opinion, and then the referendum happened and they were like, oh, well, we actually kind of supported it. And after the fact, you know, and I feel like those organisations had the potential to really sway a lot of people's like vote, you know?
Yeah, I found it quite annoying that it became this like political football almost, where even the Prime Minister was kind of grilled, well, what did you vote? Because you knew where they were going to go with it. Like if she admitted to voting yes, like, okay, all my conservative voters,
Yeah.
do you really want that? So this is kind of what it was. It was just this kind of like almost moral shaming around even supporting that. Like you don't necessarily have to do it, but it's just like if you're supporting that, you're a
You're damned if
morally
you do.
questionable person.
Yeah, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's like the stuff that's happening with the vaccine, right? It's like it's no matter what stand you take, people are gonna have an opinion about it.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, political football. That's a whole another issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, look. Thank you for coming through tonight. That was really insightful. Hearing about these kind of things from a person kind of, for lack of a better word, on the front line, dealing with these things. You know, and your work is obviously very important. And if anything, I feel like a lot of people would underestimate just how important your work is, because you know you're trying to address something that will have long-lasting consequences into the future. Yeah. So no, I really appreciate you coming through and giving us some knowledge.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
No, it was
What's
my
up for your
pleasure.
mind?